Welcome back, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all today. I'm really excited for today's talk. I'm going to be joined by MC360 Lead Practitioner Kimberley Quirk, who, if you've been here before, you have met her and know her, and we'll be joined by Indoor Environmental Professional Jessica McQuade. Our topic today is the symptoms of a moldy house, home mold testing, and mold remediation tips for sensitive people. So before I bring our experts up, I'd love to know, please share in the comments, where are you tuning in from? Or if you've been dealing with MCAS, and I'd love to know, has mold been on your radar, or is this something new that you're exploring and wondering about? So I know for me, mold has definitely been one of those pieces that I am still currently navigating on my own healing journey, both the detox and taking care of the environmental pieces and removing that trigger. So I'm really looking forward to hopefully gaining insight for myself on how I can improve my environment to be healthier for my own healing journey. All right, you guys know what's coming up next. Our disclaimers: this presentation is for informational and educational purposes. It's not meant to treat, diagnose, cure, or prevent illness. So be sure to discuss any health recommendations with your healthcare provider. And in full transparency, some of the links used during this presentation or on our website are affiliate links, which means MC360 may take a very small commission if you purchase through our links, and we only recommend products that we love and use personally or use in the MC360 practice. All right, so today we are going to be talking about the top tips for identifying mold issues, finding mold through testing versus inspection, common misconceptions about remediation, and then we'll be sharing some remediation and prevention tips. And if we have time, we will do a live Q&A, so feel free to throw your questions up in the comments. Only ask it once, that helps us keep track, and keep it on the topic of today's show, with the reminder that we're not able to answer in-depth personal questions. So please don't share all the details about your personal mold and asking about whether or not you should be doing this or that, but keep it as general as possible so the whole community can learn from it. All right, so our special guest today, who I'll bring up in just a second, is Jessica McQuade, and she is she's the owner and operator of Mold Mentor LLC and Moldy LLC. She provides virtual mold consulting worldwide and residential mold inspections in the Denver area. So I'm going to bring up Kimberly and Jessica now. Welcome, guys. And Jessica, if you could kick us off today with just sharing a little bit about your own personal story. How did you get here? How did you become a mold inspector?
Yeah, it's been a weird journey. It's not where I expected to be in life, that's for sure. So really my story started in 2015. My husband and I moved to Paris for a work opportunity. And I remember it was like it was yesterday. We opened the front door to our apartment and got hit with like a wall of mold smell. And I remember thinking, ooh, it's super moldy in here. And I knew it was mold, but I had no idea what mold could do to me. So turned out there were several active leaks in that apartment. And the bathroom, clearly there was a broken ventilation system, which is pretty important in a 150-year-old stone building in a very damp climate. So the bathroom clearly had been like painted over many times. A couple months into living there, the paint started cracking and like peeling off in these big thick sheets of paint, and you could see just big black splotches of growth on the wall underneath. Yeah, it was not good. So in hindsight, we were there almost a year in that apartment. And in hindsight, I can see very clearly I was symptomatic like immediately. You know, I had the classic ice pick headache, and insomnia, anxiety, depression, rage, which was like super out of character for me, pain, like weird pain, numbness. So yeah, that's where it definitely began. Fast forward to 2020, and we moved back to the States and land in the Denver area, buy our dream house, move in on March 1st, 2 weeks later, go into lockdown, COVID lockdown, and then basically didn't leave the house for like a year. So during that year, I went from sick to like completely debilitated, gathering symptoms, like by the week. I racked up about 36 symptoms. By the time I had a medical practitioner, I was working with a GP who was an MD studying functional medicine. And she said to me one day, "Have you ever lived in a moldy building?" And I was like, "Yes, I have." We've been trying to figure out for a year and a half, like what was going on. Nobody could figure it out. And so that started me down this journey of determining like, oh, it's mold illness. I'm sick from mold exposure. And then ultimately figuring out after multiple rounds of inspection, it's in my house. And then going through remediation and just that whole process, and in total, it was like over 7 years of dealing with this stuff. And everything I had to learn just to navigate myself and my family and my home through that process, I was like, I have to do something with this. This is too hard. Like, it cannot be that this is this hard and that people have to deal with this when they're this compromised, health-wise and cognitively. So that was when I started Mold Mentor, my consulting business. And after a couple of years of doing that, I started my inspection business because I couldn't not. At that point, like I knew I could do it. I knew I could do it in the way that it needed to be done for people like me. And I knew how important that was. So that's how I somehow ended up where I am now. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And so, our community is very familiar with the 36 plus symptoms, right? Mast cell activation syndrome can really present itself in a wide variety of ways. And I know Kimberly has had different symptoms, like you're mentioning the ice pick and the, some of the other ones. And Kimberly, I know you've shared before, but what are some of your symptoms? Like when you're in a moldy building, I know it can help for people to know they're not alone.
Yeah. So I moved from mold to mold. So it was different in different parts and different kinds of mold I've figured out. So in black mold, I was chronic fatigue, immunosuppression. That's when my Lyme came out, my long list of all these chronic infections that my body just could not clear. Everything, including like 3 kinds of cancerous HPV. I was on the road to go to an oncologist because my body couldn't clear it. And they were like, there's something wrong with your immune system. And then when I moved to Aspergillus penicillin, unknowingly, before I knew mold was an issue, it was more, that's what it flipped the switch more to mast cell. And it was hives. It was over body, just, hypersensitive to everything. But yeah, hives, anaphylaxis, flushing, itching, not able to sleep, those kinds of things. Yeah, just a histamine overdrive. Yeah.
Oh yeah, mine has been like that chronic fatigue and gut symptoms for sure. Just knowing that, like, until I get that gut out of my body, my gut's just gonna continue to be an issue. So symptoms can present itself really differently when mold toxicity is present. So let's see, Kimberly, I'm going to bring our slides back up. And I'd love for you to kind of just give us an overview, like what is mold toxicity if our audience is new to this and they're not aware yet. What does it show up as?
So if you have suspected mast cell or suspected sensitivity, like the hyper-regulation of the immune system, upregulation, looking at mold toxicity is going to be huge. So mold toxicity is the buildup of mold and mold toxins in your body faster than your body can get rid of them or detox them. This results in a variety of like dysfunctions and potential symptoms across a wide range of areas. So like we were saying, some of us have more neuro symptoms, which can look like, POTS, brain fog, those kinds of things. Immune system dysregulation, like I was talking about, where you're immune suppressed, but it could also be upregulation, but just it's that dysregulation of the immune system. Food intolerances. For some people, that's the only thing that shows up at the beginning, right? So a lot of food intolerances, that just isn't making sense, right? Like you always, for the rest, earlier parts of your life, maybe could tolerate these foods, and suddenly you can't tolerate anything. And you keep losing foods. Gut dysfunction. So for some people, that looks like too fast, and some people it looks like way too slow, like that constipation piece. And like Jamie was talking about, gut issues for sure. And then hormone disruption is huge as well. And sometimes that, and I know for me too, it was, oh, you're a female, so it's just changing hormones, and it wasn't. That's the first thing I was told long before any of this was on my radar, was like that hormone disruption happened for sure.
Yeah. And for those who maybe haven't been around for a while, like we see, like when MCAS is present, most people come to us knowing or suspecting mast cell activation syndrome. And one of the first things we do is test the body for mold, and we see it in over 95% of cases. So, if you haven't thought about mold yet and you're joining us for, Mold Month this month to just learn a little bit more, we hope that you guys get some tidbits to take away and explore it, because it can be worth just ruling out this piece as well.
I can say from my end, it was as I got sicker and sicker, like once we got to this house in Denver is when I started picking up MCAS, MCS, multiple chemical sensitivity. POTS was like the last thing to come on. And that's when I was like, passing out regularly. And it was just like, okay, something is really, really wrong here. And interestingly, as I addressed the exposure and started working on detoxing from mold, POTS fell off first. Mm-hmm. Still dealing with a bit of the chemical sensitivity and the mast cell activation syndrome. Those I think are a little bit more challenging for me for whatever reason to get rid of. But I also still probably, as you were saying, Kimberly, earlier, it's interesting for me as someone who goes out and does inspections. I wear a ton of PPE, protective equipment, personal protective equipment, like a very intensive respirator, and I'm sealed up from head to toe. But I'm still sensitive enough that even through all of that, I still get I take hits, I take mold hits, and I can distinguish different symptoms that I get from different molds. Stachybotrys makes me nauseous, like instantly. Chaetomium, like, makes me so fatigued. I had an inspection the other day. I had to pull over and take a nap in my car and I didn't even know it at the time. I suspected it because I saw it, but once I got the samples back, confirmed, yep, it was chaetomium exposure. So it's like, it's interesting when you're hypersensitive that it's amazing what your body can do.
Oh yeah. It's like the mold results are in, right? Where it's like a walking ERMI test.
Yeah.
And I experienced the same thing. I think I told you when I was looking at new homes, just, I could come out of a home and have a couple hives and be like, yeah, that's not the home for me. I know that they have a mold issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow. All right. Okay. So Kimberly or Jessica, who either one of you wants to kick us off, where are some of these common exposures happening for people?
Yeah, I can take that. So homes, yours, friends, families, anybody's. I mean, we estimate, depending on what stats you go by, anywhere from like 50% to 80, we have it there, 50 to 80% of buildings, homes and commercial, are have water damage. And where there's water damage, there's usually mold. And that's because we have plumbing, like we'll talk about it more, but where we see this most commonly, what the most common triggers are for this kind of stuff to happen. But plumbing and buildings being buildings, we have roofs, we have windows, we have weather, but it's that and plumbing are like the two biggest sources of water. So work, school, any building where there's plumbing and a roof or a building envelope, like there's a risk. So yeah, we're mentioned here about codes in the 70s, changing the way we construct buildings, making them more airtight and more prone to mold issues. Yeah, that's absolutely an issue, and it's continuing to be a trend, right? As we're moving more towards green initiatives in buildings, we're adding things like spray foam, and we're seeing a lot of issues with that. Not to say that it's always going to be a problem, but if it's not done exactly how we need it to be done, then it definitely can make us more prone to trapped moisture in the building envelope. And yeah, we mentioned 50 to 80%, but that's absolutely, I mean, the EPA states 50% of buildings. And, as somebody in the industry, I know it's much higher than that, in houses that I inspect. Now, of course, it's a sample, it's a biased sample because people calling me thinking they might have mold or worried they might have mold, but we're looking at stats like in the 90s, 90% plus where we go in and we find it. It's very, very common.
Yeah. And before we hopped on, like live, we were talking about like maintenance, like so many issues come down to just not being well maintained. And I think for me, like my mold exposure was at a university. And so like I should say one of my mold exposures. I'm sure I've had multiple between homes and schools and places I take my child, which I can see like the wall being ripped open because it's just, and they have a bucket and a tarp. Mm-hmm. I'm just like, I shouldn't be here, but my son goes to karate 3 days a week and it's hard to manage all that. But yeah, just the buildings that like aren't well maintained. So often it's those schools and places where it's just hard to do. Okay. Kimberly, do you have some tips or Jessica, any tips on identifying mold as an issue? I do actually see, I'm going to bring it up now. Marie is asking, symptoms seem so common to many things, which is totally true. Some of the symptoms that we recommended may not necessarily be mold related. They could have other triggers for sure. But how do you know when to suspect mold as an issue?
I'm really suspicious when it's that the ice pick pain or that internal vibration, because we only see that really with mast cell or with Bartonella. So get really suspicious, and it's easy to test for the mold in the body. So that's usually where we go with it. Anyone who comes through, we make sure we do a mold mycotoxin test, a urine mycotoxin test. I think we talked about that last week. So yeah, we like to do the real-time lab urine mycotoxin test, and generally it is showing there. Now, mind you, if you're someone who is in mold and you're really stressed out, you might not be detoxing well, and so it might not be super high. And I've had clients be told by their practitioner, like, oh, it's just a little bit high, so we don't think it's mold, which is not what we find the case. Once we start working on that detox piece, we actually see that second test go up because it's measuring what you're detoxing. So know that.
Yeah. So Kimberly, thank you for kind of like going over like identifying mold as an issue. It's really easy to test to rule out, but also knowing that that negative test or low test in the beginning may not be indicative of what's really going on. And so remaining curious is something that we always talk about. And then, so that's kind of internal identifying. Jessica, would you kind of go over the slide up right now, and how do people identify mold being an issue in their home potentially? Because it's not always visible.
Yeah, no, it's not. So the first thing I would say is do not underestimate water damage. This is something like on most cases in both my inspection and my consulting practice, it often comes back to something happened and somebody underestimated it. Somebody thought, we put a fan on it, we dried it out, we wiped it up, and sometimes that's not enough. Like if water gets, and it, water moves quickly and, it follows the path of least resistance, which is, due to gravity, going to usually be going down. And so even if you think, your floor meets the wall and it's, it can't possibly go there because I can see that the floor meets the wall. Well, there's a gap there, that's very small, but it's not small for water to go. So yeah, it's often misunderstood, not fully remediated, not dealt with aggressively enough. And that's where we usually find it. Like that's one of the first things I do when I'm going into a house. We do an intake before we even go in, and we ask the question, what's the history on the home? What water events have occurred that you know of since you've been there? Every little thing, everything from, a toilet bowl overflowed, a sink leaked, a dishwasher leaked, super common, washing machine leaked or overflowed, a big one of those 5-gallon jugs of water leaked. I've seen a couple of those. All those things. It doesn't take that much water to go get under substrate, under flooring, to get trapped between the floor and the subfloor, or underneath where the wall meets the floor, and enough for the baseboard to wick it up, or the drywall to get, enough moisture there on the back side of the drywall. And that's how we end up with concealed mold. Pay attention to mystery symptoms. So we were just kind of talking about that. Yeah, it is really hard. I mean, I sat down a couple years ago one day and went through all the sources of information on mold, illness, and plus my own experience. And I got up to like 90 something symptoms, right? Because it affects everybody differently. And, for those of us like myself, I grew up in New England, spent my whole childhood in the woods. So of course, in the midst of all of my, mold illness stuff, tested for Lyme. And of course I had Lyme and co-infections to boot. So like you, Kimberly, we were running viral panels and coming up with like, oh, you have 2 different kinds of walking pneumonia. You have, like 6, 7 different active infections. And it was like, my body was just, everything was gone haywire. And it can be very, very challenging to diagnose if you're not working with the right practitioner who's mold literate, because to somebody who's not, they're just looking at this vast array of symptoms that don't add up to anything in particular, or adds up to like 12 different things. And it's like, well, you might have cancer, you might have, an autoimmune disease, you might have, this, that. And really what it comes down to is mold. So when you're in that situation where it's like you're being diagnosed with all these different things and none of them quite feel right, or they feel like just diagnoses that are getting slapped on you because they don't know what else to make of all this stuff, that to me is like, ooh, start looking at some environmental stuff. And mold is obviously one of the biggest ones to look at.
Yeah.
Realize the problem's not always visible. So like I said, it can be quite concealed. Like my house, there was no sign whatsoever. There were no smells. There was no visible water damage. There was no visible mold. And, this house nearly took me out. So it can be quite concealed. And just because it's concealed doesn't mean it's not affecting you. This is something I hear a lot, this misnomer of like, this misconception of like, well, if it's behind the wall, it can't affect you. If it's under the floor, it can't affect you. Like, false, absolutely false. Your walls are not airtight. Your floors are not airtight. The house breathes. There's pressure differentials occurring within the house all the time. Your walls have outlets, light switches. Those are, openings in the wall. Even where your baseboard meets your floor, it's not sealed. So, yeah, that's what I would say about. We can talk more about that, but that's just the top line.
Yeah. So you've kind of already touched on this, but where are these common sources of mold growth in the home?
Yeah, if I think about inspections, the places where we most commonly see mold issues, crawl spaces, basements. And again, that's because crawl spaces, because they're rarely done right. So, we often see water intrusion happening in crawl spaces, or water coming up through the soil. There's also, if you have a crawl space, most of your plumbing is coming down and then exiting the home through the crawl space. Basements, if you have a basement instead of a crawl space, same thing. It's the lowest level of the house, right? So any water events that happen above eventually usually make their way down, and it's the home to most of your plumbing, at least like where it all kind of comes together and comes in and goes out of the house. Attics are big because nobody goes on their roof regularly and checks their roof. And also nobody goes in their attics. So things happen in there and they just go on unknown. The other thing I'll say about attics, which I like to share because this is another one of these very common misconceptions, that people are like, well, I have a new roof, or before I bought the house, they put a new roof on it. Great. But what about the roof leak that occurred the year before they put the new roof on? Because when they put a new roof on, 99.9% of the time, all they're doing is taking off the shingles and the waterproofing membrane, whatever they've got there, and then just replacing those. What they don't take off is the decking, the actual structural wood. And that inside of that structural wood is decking in your attic. It's like the ceiling of your attic. And so if a roof leak has occurred, now we have water damage and mold on the ceiling of the attic, if you will. That doesn't go away just because you replace the shingles. I see that all the time. My attic's got to be okay because we replaced the roof. Two different things. And then what I call wet rooms. So anywhere there's plumbing, kitchens, bathrooms, laundry rooms, etc., because things leak, plumbing leaks. And then the materials around appliances. So I'm talking floors, cabinetry, walls around dishwashers, refrigerators, HVAC systems, water heaters, because again, like they're water-based appliances, they leak, they fail, and then things around them get wet and don't get dealt with.
And I would add the humidity piece, right?
Yeah.
See somebody asking you what's high humidity.
Right. So let's talk about that for a second. So I'm talking about, you know, the more obvious water damage events. Of course, in certain parts of the country and the world where we've got higher humidity, sustained high humidity. I've seen it in a job in Connecticut, actually, where they didn't have air conditioning. They just were leaving. They had a water event, which preempted all of this. So they had mold growth from a water event. A toilet had leaked and leaked down through 2 stories. And so they had that as sort of the event that prompted mold growth. But then they didn't have air conditioning. It was summertime. They were leaving the windows open. And it was like 75% humidity inside the house. And we had ambient mold growth. Like, I remember looking through virtually, looking at photos and having them walk me through. And it was like, but there was a pair of, I'll never forget it. There was a pair of like boots, like leather boots, just on the floor in a bedroom, covered in mold, you know, nightstand covered in mold, books covered in mold. And it was like, yeah, this is what can happen when you, all you need is, you know, certain species of mold, genera are very like just ubiquitous. They're everywhere all the time. So when you put them in, when you have a building that's closed, you know, an enclosed space, high humidity, a little bit of dust. So anything that's airborne, right, eventually settles on surfaces and becomes part of our dust. So those ubiquitous mold spores are in your air, they settle on your surfaces, become part of your dust. Then you add high humidity and now you're growing mold on that dust and whatever surface that it's sitting on. And then it can grow into the materials if they're, you know, porous materials just from humidity alone. Yeah.
Yeah. So the range we're usually looking for humidity is under 50%.
Ideally, we want under 50% just because there's a buffer. You know, there is a little bit of a buffer in there. We know ambient mold growth like that is typically not going to happen until you're at like 60-65%.
Good to know.
But, you know, we want that little bit for people who are hypersensitive. Like, let's stay far away from that. So let's not hover at like 59% and hope it's okay, right? So we want that buffer in there. But theoretically, you know, you should be very safe at 50% from humidity-based ambient mold growth.
And I will say, I have clients, I see somebody talking about being in Arizona, an extremely dry client. I mean, we have clients in every state, in every environment, because we have rain and we have indoor plumbing.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely a thing too, that people like, what, you know, I see, and I understand this very deeply as a hypersensitive person myself who's been dealing with mold for years. Like, I understand the question, like, where can I go that's safe? What state is the safest for mold? And like, you know, I'm booked out for months on my inspection side. I'm in Colorado, like we're a high desert climate. It's extremely dry. It's like 16% humidity in my house right now. It's so dry. It's like dangerously dry. You know, that's like very, very low humidity is not good either for your health. And, you know, like I said, I find it in probably 90% of houses I go into. It's, even though we don't have to contend with the humidity, we still have plumbing and weather. So yeah, it's everywhere, unfortunately.
Yeah. Oh, my parents have a second home in Arizona, and because it's a second home, there's not someone there all the time. And they had a flood from a burst pipe. Oof. And of course, like what it takes about like 48 hours for mold to just be able to start growing. And so, you know, it went unnoticed for who knows how long, until the caretaker came and checked on it. And so, yeah, Arizona's not immune. No. We had Michael Schrantz on, God, I think it was at the end of last year at this point. And, you know, he talks about you can't avoid mold. Like mold is part of our environment and we absolutely need it when we start thinking about like what it does in nature and how it is part of, you know, our life cycles. And so it's not necessarily like completely avoiding it, but like, you know, as an indoor environmental professional, you have tips on how to create a healthier environment, but also like what can we do to, you know, take care of our health and things like that. So some really great questions coming in, and we'll definitely get to some of those, guys. So just hold tight for our Q&A. All right, so testing versus inspection. So so when people come to our clinic, they might not know about mold yet, versus like Jessica, when they're contacting you, you kind of already said this, like there's a bias. They know that mold is most likely an issue for them. So Kim, I'd love if you kind of talk a little bit about like the testing that we use in the clinic and how it can like open people's eyes. And then, you know, Jessica, if you can go into kind of the inspection piece, that would be great.
Yeah. So yeah, in clinic, you know, we really don't see people who don't have some kind of mold past or present exposure. It just is. Doesn't mean it's the only issue, right? There's usually many things that can be going on. But at the heart of it, it can be some of that mold. So how do we test? So we're doing that real-time lab urine mycotoxin test. And if that comes back positive, then we know, okay, there's been some mold exposure, but is that past or is that present? We don't know. So then we're trying to make sure that environment's safe. And usually what we're doing is running an ERMI test to get an idea and open our eyes for what is my current environment. Is there a problem where I'm living? The problem with ERMI is it might identify the problem, but then we don't know where that problem is. So that's when we would refer to someone like Jessica to help support you to get someone in there and do more visual and more targeted testing.
Yeah, I mean, ERMI, I'll speak to for a second, is a great tool. It's one of many tools. Like so this is what I wanted to talk about here is like no test is perfect. No one test can tell you everything that you need to know, right? It's like, I describe it like a puzzle, and there's several pieces to the puzzle. And the more pieces we have, the clearer the puzzle becomes, right? Like the total picture becomes. So to me, what I also wanted to say about testing is that what concerns me out there in the industry is that I see a lot of people who are going out and doing mold testing, and I'll have people come to me and say, hey, you know, I want to do can you help me with mold testing? You know, can you give me a price for what it would cost to test my house? And I'm like, hold on. Because testing, like, it sounds great, right? It sounds scientific. You think like, oh, you can come in and do air testing, for example, and it's going to test my air. And then I get this lab report and there's numbers. So it must be scientific. It must be accurate. And, you know, there are some significant limitations to testing, especially air testing. We can talk about that later. But really every type of test has its limitations. And to your point, Kimberly, like, you can do all the testing you want. You still need to physically find it, because you can't do anything about it until you pinpoint it and have eyes on it and say, okay, here it is. Now let's go into remediation and deal with it. You know, you can't go into remediation. I have a colleague who's a remediator, and he'll sometimes get calls where people say, I did an ERMI, can you come remediate? And he's like, you got to have inspection. Like, I can't remediate off an ERMI. You know, like, what do you want me to do? Just tear your whole house apart? Like, you got to find it. So to me, you know, testing, testing is something that is a tool that should be used as part of inspection. And the inspection is really the meat of it, because that's where we find it and get eyes on it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Jessica, do you want to share some common mold misconceptions? I know you shared a few already, but.
Yeah, right. So like we were just saying, testing alone is not enough to find mold. It's not going to find it. It's going to be an indicator, you know, a gauge. Like an ERMI, I use the term, it's a gauge for like, do we potentially have a mold problem, or do we potentially not have a mold problem? Because, you know, they can be inaccurate too in both directions. Air testing. So, right, misconception, air testing tests all your air. So I was doing some math yesterday, which I'm not very good at, but I did manage to do this math, that a typical air test, so people who, you know, inspectors who come in and do air testing, a typical test they're going to do in the middle of a room. I see sometimes they come in and do it in the middle of like the house, thinking it's testing the house. You know, we'll do one on the main floor in the middle of the house, whatever room is in the middle, and I'll do one like on the stairwell of the second floor, thinking I'm testing the house by floor. So a typical air test is 5 minutes. It's 15 liters of air per minute. Long story short, the math is they're testing less than 1% of the air that you're breathing in 24 hours on one of those tests. And it also, it can only pull so much air, like it can only pull from so much space. So if there's a mold problem, you know, like over there by my microwave, and I run an air test over here, it's probably not even going to pick that up. So they're super, super limited. And it's just a shame that it sounds like air testing. Well, of course, you're testing my air. Kind of, but it's just a teeny tiny little bit. So there's different ways you can utilize air testing. You know, I'm a big proponent of using it like what I call strategically. We could talk more about that later if we want to, but I don't do ambient air testing, so it's not telling me anything. I use it as a tool in very specific ways and in very strategic manners to actually get it to tell me what I think I need it to tell me, to verify what I think is going on in a concealed situation. Okay, so another one, all mold inspectors are going to find all the mold in your house. Not going to happen. I think anyone who's been through this, you know, has a story of like, oh, they didn't find it all, or I had to go through 3 inspectors before I finally found the one who knew what they were doing. You know, this industry it's in a weird place. Like, you know, there's a handful of us who are like, oh my God, this is the way we need to be doing it. And then there's like 98% of the industry who's still doing it the way they've always been doing it. And, you know, especially for hypersensitive occupants who are sitting in their house saying, I know there's something here. I can tell because I'm sick from it. You know, it's really, really important that we find it. And, you know, coming in and doing ambient air testing is not going to find it. Fogging counts as remediation. Oof, this one makes it gets me. So we can talk more about this because otherwise, you know, I don't want to babble on about it, but fogging is not remediation. It's not. It's marketing. It's a marketing tool. It's a marketing gimmick, honestly. Like, it's fogging in very specific scenarios could be a useful tool as part of the overall remediation process, but it is not remediation in and of itself. Do not let somebody convince you that they can come in and fog your house. I don't care what kind of magic juice they put in their fogger and where it can go and how it can go through walls and get all this. No. Remediation by definition is physically removing affected materials. If there's mold growing on a cabinet, the cabinet needs to be removed. That's it, period, end of story. Encapsulation counts as remediation. This is a big one too. So like, oh, I'll just spray it or paint over it with Kills or some other, you know, fancy encapsulant product. No, same thing, like something that is physically damaged and has mold growth needs to be physically removed. Anyone who's handy can do mold remediation. Man, I've seen this go wrong many, many times. You know, but my husband's a construction guy. I've seen it. I've seen how that goes down. Mold remediation is not construction. It's not just demo. It's actually significantly more complex than that. There are, you know, principles of physics that we're playing with when we're doing mold remediation, and they're important. It's like the difference between, you know, success and failure is understanding how to do it properly. And thinking, so another misconception, remediation is not a complex process. It is complex, and you do need to know what you're doing. And it's not just throw an air scrubber in there and put some plastic up and rip stuff out. There's more to it than that.
And I will say I've seen some clients come through who decided to do a little DIY and end up a lot sicker. A lot sicker.
Yeah, I mean, mold, by the time you can see it, I have a stat over here. I don't want to get it wrong. 400 million, right? So Aspen, you talked about earlier, Aspergillus penicillium, on a postage stamp. I think I have a postage stamp. No, it's too deep in my drawer. You know, the size of a postage stamp. I can't get it with my fingers. There you go. You know, for Aspergillus penicillium, you could have I think I have the stat right, 400 million spores of Aspen on the size of a postage stamp. So by the time you can see it, it's a lot. right? This is a microscopic organism we're talking about. So when somebody's dealing with like, this much mold, that's a lot. And for somebody who's hypersensitive, like that really needs to be dealt with properly. I've seen so many situations where a bad situation has become significantly worse because of improper remediation techniques.
Yeah. Wow. Man. All right. So what if they find mold? What if somebody finds mold? What are the next steps?
Yeah, so full disclosure, I sit on the board of a nonprofit called Change the Air Foundation, and I joined them a little over a year ago because I found them as I was doing all my own research, and I'm always on the hunt for credible resources, for good, solid information, because there's so much bad information out there. And I came across them and their content. I was like so amazed by their content. They have very, very high standards. We have very, very high standards for the information that we share. So they have some excellent resources. There's a guide on their website that is literally beginning to end, like starting with, I think there might be mold, where do I start? Going through inspection, remediation, and there's how to vet professionals, how to understand, like, do they actually know what they're doing? Is this inspector, do they understand this stuff? Are they going to do things the right way for a hypersensitive occupant? Remediation. I mean, we go pretty deep into remediation and what it should look like, what you should be asking, what the answer to the questions should be that you're asking when you're vetting a professional. Small particulate cleaning, so cleaning of all the house and all the material, all the contents after remediation. It's just very, very comprehensive guide in there. So I highly recommend that people check that out. And we have some great interviews with medical professionals, environmental professionals. And then ICI is another organization that has great information out there, especially on the medical side. I know if you guys if anybody wants to speak to that.
Yeah, we typically recommend this when someone's looking for possibly a mold literate practitioner, because they have a resource that you can do that. So Michael Schrantz is on the board of that one as well. So two resources there for you guys to explore, to kind of educate yourselves on the pieces around finding competent professionals.
Yeah. And then, right, the process is that find a competent inspector, figure out where it is, what you're actually working with. A competent inspector should be putting together what's called a scope of work, which is like a remediation plan, and also sort of dictating, like, this is how your remediation should be done. You need to use 6 mil plastic. You need to establish negative pressure to this many pascals, and it should be measured with a manometer and all these things. And so then finding a competent remediator who can execute that plan, or deciding to move or sell, right? That's often a big piece of this puzzle, is like, is this even worth doing? Does it make sense financially? Am I ever going to feel safe here no matter what we do? Like, these are all very important questions to be asking at like multiple points in the journey. And then of course, work to support your body and detox mold. I'll let you speak to that.
Yeah. So, kind of figuring out, do I feel better when I'm not living here or not working here? Then trying to do things to clean up the mold. I know we're going to do a Facebook Live coming up. So like, what if we find mold and I can't get out of it? What can we do to clean up that air? So yeah, we're talking about cleaning up the air, which we do talk about fogging. If you're living in a short-term situation where it's a place you don't own and you can't remediate it. But we have clients who fog monthly, just to maintain until they can get through their lease and get to another place. So, air filtration, all those kinds of things. And then, how can we, it's hard to detox the mold when you're still in it. So it's a maintenance kind of thing.
Yeah. So Emily was asking, is it okay to stay in a room with mold, possibly black mold, for a few more weeks until I move out? So this is what Kimberly's talking about. Maybe fogging is a temporary solution, not a replacement for remediation, but can you get an air purifier? So we'll definitely touch on those. But what Kimberly just said is and Neil Nathan has said it before, you can get better, but you can't get truly well as long as there is a continued mold exposure.
And it's great that she's getting out. And is there things you can do to clean up temporarily the air quality? Go to a different room, sleep in different rooms, stay at a friend's house, open your windows, air filtration.
Okay. Some remediation tips. I want to just do a time check. We have about 15 minutes left and some questions we want to get answered. So if we can go through this quickly for everyone.
Yeah, so DIY remediation, we already touched on that, is a mistake to avoid. Hiring the wrong inspection professional. This is a tough one. Sometimes somebody seems good and then they come in and then they don't do what you expect them to do. And it is what it is. We're working with the industry that we're working with, and you do your best to vet them on the front end. Hiring the wrong remediation professional, that's a pretty important one to get right. So I definitely recommend checking out the resources on changetheairfoundation.org to make sure you're asking all the right questions and listening for all the right answers, making sure you're getting somebody who's going to do it successfully. Skipping post remediation verification. So this is something that as an IEP I do. So it's the tail end of remediation. You're supposed to bring someone in, a third party inspection professional, to come in and verify the success of the remediation. So I'll go in, and before they call it done, containment is still up. They're done doing all the work that they've done. I go in and I go do an inspection. I do multiple types of testing to verify, yes, we have reached success. Now you're done. And sometimes we go in and find stuff and say, you know what? We have not reached success. You need to go back in and take out more materials, or go back in and re-clean. Then we'll come back and retest and verify that we're done before you call it done. Yeah. That's very, very important.
Great. Thank you. Prevention tips. So how do we, prevent mold from growing?
Yeah. So the biggest one is prevent and monitor, water damage. And if something happens, take necessary action immediately. So like immediately remove affected materials. And people don't always want to hear this because we like to downplay it because we don't want it to be a big deal. But dealing with water damage is so, like with a water event immediately, is going to be significantly cheaper, like many, many times fold, cheaper, to pull out some flooring, pull out pop off baseboards, cut the drywall that got wet. I know it sucks and nobody wants to make it a bigger deal than it feels like it should be. But if that gets moldy, it is going to be you're at risk for getting sick from it. And then going into mold remediation, it's a much bigger deal. So, and much more expensive. So I highly recommend rip stuff out. That's the only way to be sure, unfortunately. If it gets wet, rip it out, and then dry, structural materials that are left, like framing. Cleaning. So like we talked about that case in Connecticut, accumulated dust plus high humidity alone can allow mold to grow, ambient mold to grow. And so managing humidity would be the last thing. That's like just a really obvious one. If you're in a more humid climate, you want to do what you can to manage it. Dehumidification primarily is going to be your friend.
Great. All right. So for those who are like, oh, I need Jessica to come to my house or do an environmental inspection. So you can find her on Instagram and Facebook at Mold Mentor LLC. And her business for inspection, if you're in the Denver area, she may be available for that. But we've been recommending her in clinic to do that environmental piece, to kind of consult on, not inspect necessarily, but kind of coach through like, what should that first step be if I suspect mold in my current environment. So thank you so much for being here today. And hopefully, many people in our community related to you and can find some peace in knowing that there may be answers out there to make that environment a little bit more safe. All right. I think we have some time for some questions. Let's see. And Kimberly alluded to later this month, we will be doing a live on if you can't move right away. So if that's kind of where you feel like you are, stay tuned. In a week or two, we'll be going over that as well. All right. So let's see. Hi from Santa Cruz. I've had MCAS for 18 years and only found out. Oh, hi, Michelle. You are not alone. Mold is definitely something that we see a lot in this community, even when someone's been sick for years.
Yeah.
All right. Joe is asking, how long can mold toxins hang around in the body? Could someone still have them from an exposure more than 5 years ago? So Kimberly,
yeah,
you look like you're done.
Yeah, decades. I mean, people who've had childhood exposure, that can be still in the body if it hasn't fully detoxed and hasn't gone through a full protocol to detox that. So it stores in our fat. In our organs. So yeah, it can hang around for decades.
Yeah. Here's one. Can mold be the root cause of insomnia?
Absolutely. It's one of the big things we see. I mean, it makes sense too, right? It's probably upregulating your histamine and then you're not able to sleep. Plus, your body's a little bit in fight or flight. Your nervous system knows it's there. That's the reason why it's getting dysregulated.
Yeah. That's one of my biggest symptoms, has always been.
Yeah. Lane is asking, I'm curious your thoughts on ozone after mold remediation. Still feeling tired when she goes home, but better when away.
Is she talking about in the body or in the house? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'm
assuming but in the house.
Okay, yeah.
Because better when I'm away from home. So I'm not a big proponent. There are mixed opinions on ozone. I'm not a proponent of ozone. What I would say in your situation is we need to check and see if there's still a source, because sometimes we don't find it all. We go into remediation and we remediated the kitchen and the bathroom, but we didn't realize there was something going on in the laundry room, right? So there may still be a remaining source, or it could have been an unsuccessful remediation. Maybe they didn't get it all, or they didn't clean well enough. And maybe there was, if they didn't clean well enough, we could have a cross-contamination issue. And the third thing I would say before I jump to something like ozone, I would personally recommend a small particulate cleaning of the house, because for hypersensitive occupants, if there was a mold situation, it was cross-contaminating, the rest of the house. And so even though sometimes we deal with the source during remediation, the, spores, fragments, mycotoxins, things that were there in that source made their way out and into your air and then settled on your surfaces as part of your dust. So we need to remove all of that contaminated dust from the entire house for somebody who's, been sensitized to really get to like clean slate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I made that mistake myself with a mattress. I told you I moved from mold to mold, didn't know I was in black mold, moved that mattress with me and got to a certain level of better post remediation, but was like, as I was getting better, why can't I just clear this? And it was my mattress. Yeah. So mattress and carpeting. Yeah.
Part of that small particulate cleaning is evaluating contents and determining like, can I clean this or do I need to toss it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was asking, what do you recommend for crawl space? What do you recommend for attics if moldy remediation? So I think we answered that for sure. If you have anything to add.
Yeah, it's complex. It depends on what's going on, right? Like what the issue is in the crawl space, and every geography, there might be slightly different like solutions for a crawl space. And attics, yeah, like sometimes I'll say if it's what I was describing and it's the decking that's damaged and moldy, like usually, especially if it's OSB, is very tough to remediate thoroughly. So it may be a case where you have to rip the roof off and rip the decking off and replace the decking and put your roof on top of that.
All right. Carolyn is saying that she's about to run an ERMI again, 3-level house. What do you recommend for running ERMIs on multi-level homes?
So at minimum, ideally you want to do one per floor, because if you see a really big difference from one floor to another, that'll actually give you some very valuable data, right? Like 1, 2, 3, and floor 1 comes up very high with some of the scarier stuff, and 2 is similar but not as bad, and 3 is not so bad at all. Like that tells you your source is probably on the first floor. Best practice is to do small. I don't know if Michael Schranz talked about this. Even smaller areas, like 500 square feet. Mm-hmm. But then, if you have a bigger house, you're talking about 6, 7, 8 ERMIs. It gets to be cost prohibitive. So at minimum, 1 per floor would be an ideal way to try and narrow it down.
I don't know if the Clean Air Foundation has any recommendations, but do you know of any mold specialists in the UK?
I do not, unfortunately.
But you do worldwide
consulting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. But at some point we got to find somebody to get boots on the ground. So I don't know of anybody off the top of my head, but there doesn't mean there's not somebody there.
Yeah. All right. How do you clean invisible mold off painted drywall? Is vacuuming the wall sufficient?
I mean, it depends. So this is where like you've got to determine, is it condition 3, meaning actual mold growth, like mold has grown on the wall, or is it condition 2, meaning it's just contaminated dust, like I was talking about earlier? If it's condition 3 and it has grown on the wall, we're going to want to cut that drywall out because, it's porous in that mold can grow sort of into it. If it's condition 2 and it's like, well, I had a mold situation, way over there, and I'm worried about the drywall over here, then yeah, typically we would do small particulate cleaning. So a 3-piece clean would be a vacuuming, HEPA vacuuming, and then a damp wipe, and then a dry wipe. There's more details on that. I don't want to get into it because this is one of those rabbit holes where I could talk for 4 hours. But on changetheairfoundation.org, we have a whole part of that guide that I was talking about. One entire step of that guide is dedicated to small particulate cleaning. So we go into great detail on how to execute that. I would recommend checking that out.
Thank you. All right. I think we have time for 2 more. What do you suggest to assess a home if you're considering buying? If you're considering buying has mold, so the home that they're considering buying has mold, what would you suggest?
I mean, I wouldn't recommend, if you're sensitive to mold, I'd be like, I'd be hesitant to buy something that has mold. But I would go into it knowing like you're going to need to remediate that. Right. So what would you suggest to assess? I would want to get an inspector in there, an IEP, a mold inspection professional, to get in there and evaluate, like, what's the extent of it? What is remediation going to entail? Right. Like I talked about a scope of work where they write up, my scope of work, I'm going to say, hey, from this cabinet to this cabinet, those need to come out. The flooring needs to come out X number of feet. The drywall needs to get cut up X number of feet, so that you have a sense for, and you can take that then to a remediation professional, get an estimate, and think about rebuild too. Because when often you start messing around with kitchens, it's like, we got to pull out 3 of the 15 cabinets, but guess what? They don't make that cabinet anymore. So now we're redoing the entire kitchen, like unintentionally going into a kitchen reno.
Okay, so it was worded weird. They were asking what to do to see if a home has mold.
Okay. So that's what I thought maybe it was at first. So honestly, like, you got to throw as many things at it as you can. So I don't even do pre-purchase inspection anymore. And the reason for that is because I cannot get as invasive as I might need to get to be able to find it all. So, home inspector obviously is part of the normal process. You want to try and find one who's more mold literate, or at least more aware of water damage, and really push them on that. Hey, I need you to look for every possible, spot where there might be some water damage. Just don't have them run ambient air testing, so it's wasting your money. So utilize them if you can get a mold inspector in there as well. We're looking at different things. When I was doing them, I often was going in at the same time as the home inspector, and they're looking at certain things and I'm looking at other things. Some of it overlaps, but most of it doesn't. And then, mold dogs are another tool if you have one near you.
We have that question right here.
Okay. Yep. So we have one locally that I co-inspect with sometimes. So we'll go in together, and dog goes and does his thing, and then I circle back around and get the debrief. Or sometimes I travel, go with him, or they debrief me after, and I can say, okay, I don't see anything there, but let's do a deeper dive. This is where I can get into using invasive techniques, right? Get into a wall cavity, look in there with a camera, do some cavity sampling. We can aggravate a floor, get underneath the floor from the ceiling of the floor below, things like that. ERMI can be another tool. So this is when you're looking at a house, it's like throw everything that you possibly can. It's a big investment, and we got to just do our best with the tools we can utilize.
But maybe like doing a contingency on, like, if you put an offer, let's say it's contingent on.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Committed to it.
Because then you could own the problem.
Yeah.
And then you can't live there.
Yeah.
That's a huge issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Get a solid contingency in there, inspection contingency.
All right. Well, thank you Jessica so much for your expertise and wisdom today. And Kimberly, as always, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and wisdom as well. I do want to let everyone know that because it is Mold Month, we are offering a sale on our mold course. So you can get the basic course for only $149 right now, which is $100 off its normal price and $200 off the advanced course. So you can find that on our website at masscell360.com/mold course. And maybe Cam or Zach can drop that into the comments for you. And let's see, what else? Yeah, if you find that, you let's say you get the mold course and you give it a go and you just feel like you need that extra level of support, maybe one-on-one, you're more than welcome to apply to the clinic. We have 2 tiers of support, foundational and advanced. So if you're not quite sure which one is right for you, there's more information at mastcell360.com/application, or you can always email us at support@mastcell360.com to learn a little bit more about, we can answer your questions and figure out which would be best. But there's some pre-screening questionnaires to help you decide what might be the right fit for you. So I just want to say thank you again for Kimberly and Jessica. We're so happy you could join us today. That environmental piece is so important for removing and reducing that exposure and removing those triggers that might be keeping us stuck. And so we really like to educate our community on the importance of that. And so, just a reminder, Jessica can help you with that environmental piece if you need some consulting, and MastCell360 can help you on detoxing the mold that may already be in there. Is there anything that either of you would like to share with our community before we sign off for today?
I would just say, if you haven't looked at mold, look at mold. And I know it can be scary, and sometimes we don't want to know and we don't want to see it. But I know for me, and probably both of you here, it was the linchpin that kind of moved us forward and feeling better.
Yeah, for sure. And it can be dealt with. Like as scary and intimidating and overwhelming as it is, especially if you're suffering the effects of it cognitively, it can be just feel impossible. It can be done, and it can be done actually rather efficiently, and you can get past it.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.